We tend to associate buying a newer car with helping the environment, lowering the emissions and the CO2 output of vehicles. But the recent video that we did on here about keeping an older car, it was about 25% of the responses that we received stated a reason for keeping older cars as it's more environmental. It's more green to keep an older car on the road. So I thought it'd just be interesting to discuss that assertion. Is it really more environmentally beneficial to hang on to an older car? So there's a few factors we're going to look at. The overall CO2 emissions in making the car, disposing of the car, its lifetime emissions as well, and some of the other factors that we need to take into account before we come to a conclusion as to whether it's more economically viable to keep older cars on the road or to just replace the cars as they start getting a few years old. So firstly, with facts and figures and statistics, you can really manipulate them and present the ones that back up your own argument. And that's done by thousands of YouTubers out there. And it's really sort of human nature. We look at statistics and facts that back up our opinion, and we use those to reinforce our opinion. Now, how much CO2 is produced manufacturing a car? Well, if you ask the question, how much food waste does each household produce, you would get a very different answer to that question depending on who you speak to, where they live, the country, maybe the economic background of that family as well would have a bearing on the food waste that they produce. And that's also true of CO2 in production of a car. It's very, very subjective. It depends on where the factories are, what sort of cars that are being made. So all we can really talk about are generalized benchmarks and really draw a consensus, an overall picture from the various claims, reports and statistics that are available out there. So your conventional internal combustion engine vehicle, the average production CO2 cost of that is 5.6 tons of CO2. Figures varied from about 4.6 metric tons to 6 metric tons. So obviously there's quite a wide variation in there, but that's quite a big number. If we go to a battery vehicle, the manufacturing cost is actually much higher, and it's primarily down to the batteries, making the batteries. So the same sources and statistics quote about 10 to 16 tons of CO2 producing a battery vehicle. Now that straight away makes it look like it's more environmentally responsible to have a combustion engine car than a battery vehicle. But we've got to think about the lifetime emissions of the car. So with a conventional internal combustion engine, we're pumping CO2 out of the exhaust every day we use it. But that's not the case with an electric vehicle. Although you're not releasing CO2 as you drive your electric vehicle, CO2 is often a byproduct of producing the electricity. It's hard to determine how much CO2 there is in electricity production, basically because different regions, different areas, and even at different times, they use different methods to generate power. So here in the UK, we've had traditionally coal-fired power stations, oil-burning power stations, gas-burning power stations, and we've got wind farms and solar and other green forms of energy. So there's lots of different sources of electricity. The nuclear powered option and hydroelectric obviously offer additional power to the grid. So depending on what the demand is at any set time, they can turn off these polluting sources and switch to the less polluting sources. It's quite hard to put an exact figure on the amount of CO2 that an electric vehicle releases in its lifetime. But we'll go back to our original assertion that keeping an older car is more environmentally beneficial than getting a new car every few years. So when you get rid of a car, there are CO2 emissions associated with that, transporting the car, transporting the components around, dealing with the components that come off the car. Even if they're recycled, energy has to be pumped into that. So the consensus seems to be about 5% of the lifetime emissions of a vehicle is involved in dismantling it, destroying it, recycling it, and disposing of that vehicle. So far, we're looking at the internal combustion engine. The manufacturing cost is equal to about a year and a half, maybe 2 years worth of its overall CO2 emissions. So that is actually quite a big chunk, and it's an even bigger chunk if you dispose of the car after 5 or 10 years as a percentage. If you can keep that car on the road for 20, 25, 30 years, the 5 odd metric tons of CO2 used to produce the car is spread out over that longer period of time. So is that the only factor that we take into account? Well, think about maintaining an internal combustion engine. We've got oil changes. With any car, even electric cars, we need to replace brakes, and there's other components that will need to be replaced, and you're dealing with the waste of those old components as we have to dispose of them and hopefully recycle them. So there are ongoing environmental costs of just owning a car, be it an electric vehicle or a conventional combustion engine vehicle. Most people that left a comment on that video that I quoted at the outset stated that there's about 60% stated that they do the repairs and fix stuff themselves. About 30% would go to a garage for the more complex repairs, and the remaining 10% own the car, but they don't really do anything to it themselves. They rely on a trusted local mechanic. So there are costs associated with keeping older cars on the road, particularly if it's unreliable. So if you've got a reliable older car, you're laughing. You don't have these high repair costs that can creep in. But we've also got to think about the total cost of ownership during the period that we own the car. And this is where things start to get really interesting. So we're not going to factor in lease, interest costs and repayments and that sort of thing. We're just going to look at the cost of a new vehicle, £35,000. After 3 years, that drops to £17,000. So that effectively cost us £3,000 per year while we have owned that new car. And then after 3 years, that person would typically start again looking at £3,000 per year to fund this new car. Now, we've got to think about how much CO2 we produced earning £3,000 a year to pay for the car. So whatever car it is, we're having to go out and earn money to pay for it. And that is generally going to cost CO2. So that's quite a big factor. Now, when you come to buying older cars, the depreciation slows up considerably. If you bought a 10-year-old car for £9,000 and sold that 3 years later, you would typically yield about £5,000 for that. So that works out as £1,300 per year. So you've needed to earn less money to fund that car. Now, for some people, buying a 10-year-old car, they think they're buying unreliability and a lot of problems. And that is not always the case. A lot of older cars, especially if they've been looked after and well maintained, and people have checked out the videos that we've been putting out on this channel as to how to properly maintain and keep your car running, will have really good cars with that low cost of ownership over the period that they have it. Now, there's people out there that would buy, say, the 3-year-old car, and they would keep that for about 10 years. So buying a 3-year-old car at 17,000, keeping it for 10 years, so selling at 5,000, we're looking at an annual cost of £1,200 per year. So that averages out quite nicely. We've had the benefit of a fairly new car, 3 years old, so we've been able to keep on top of the maintenance and just make sure it maintains its reliability. We're not buying a car that's potentially been neglected. We know a little bit about the history, and that, I think, is where a lot of people are. They'll buy a good quality used car and really look after it and make sure they keep it in good order. So then at the other end of the spectrum, and a few of you have commented that this is what you do, we're talking about bangonomics. This is where you buy an old banger or an old beater and you just keep it on the road as long as you can, but you're not going to spend much money on it because it didn't cost you very much money to start with. So in some cases, people are talking about hundreds that they've spent on a car instead of thousands. And this car will probably service them for a year, sometimes 2 years, maybe even longer. If anything major goes, you just get rid of the car. There's no point shelling out for expensive repairs on a car that has got such a low resale value. It's just not economically viable in most cases. Let me know in the comments what your thoughts are on that situation. But that effectively means you're only spending a matter of hundreds per year to have the benefit of a car and transportation. So why do people hang on to older cars? Well, going through all of the comments that were left, there was over 1,000 comments, so I really thank you for that on that last video. Over half of the comments that responded said it was for financial reasons. They didn't want to waste money keep upgrading to newer cars all the time. 25% we've mentioned it was environmental concerns. They thought it was more economically viable to hang on to an older car. And we've seen in this video that that is certainly the case. It depends on quite a few factors that we've discussed. So I'll leave you to draw your own conclusions on that. Sentimental value was also a big one. Nearly 20%, I think it was about 18% of people that stated a reason had a sentimental attachment to their car. It was a family car that had been handed down to them. They had memories. They'd had the car a long time. Maybe it was their first car or some other milestone in their life when they purchased this car. So that's the reason why they're hanging on to it. And interestingly, 15% thought that an older car is more durable and more reliable. And that's certainly the case when you start looking at the silly faults that we get on modern cars through the complex infotainment systems that they're installing, and also the pollution controls, the EGRs, the particulate filters that have been added, the super lean burn engines, the low friction piston rings, the different components that have been added to make the engine more efficient. They often fail. They often cause problems, and that is something that's picked up as they get older. So these new cars, as they hit the 10 to 15-year-old mark, may well have serious expenditure required to keep them on the road, whereas an older car would not necessarily have that same problem. I find it interesting as well, even brands that have had legendary reliability through the whole history, like Toyota and Lexus, we're starting to see videos, comments, news items, feedback from customers that they're starting to experience problems from these super reliable brands. So general manufacturing quality seems to have gone downhill in recent years, and that's another reason why people aren't buying new cars. It was interesting, I think it was about 2019, Audi revamped the A3 interior and had a fairly complex infotainment system. Now, it's hard to use that infotainment system. There's so many menus, so many functions. Even changing the clock, putting it back an hour, has left some people struggling and looking for a manual or further instruction on how to just change the clock. So one of the reasons that they came so low in reliability surveys was down to infotainment glitches, losing connectivity, crashing, just general problems with the navigation and the instruments on the car. It's sad really to see a brand like Audi falling so low down in reliability tables just because of the complex infotainment that they've added that people don't necessarily want. People just want a car that works, not one that's tracking their every motion, that's controlling every aspect of driving to make it super safe for them. There are obviously some safety features that we want and that are desirable, but to a lot of people, they turn off a lot of these features. They just don't want this nannying car looking after them because it has caused other problems. With the best will in the world, these systems are inflexible. Lane assist has pushed people into potholes where they've been trying to avoid it. Brake assist has caused cars to suddenly stop because a bird or some obstacle in the road has been misinterpreted and the car has gone into full-on brake mode. So please let me know what you think about this topic. Do you feel it is more environmentally responsible to keep an older car? What are your experiences with keeping an older car? Has it cost you a lot of money? And would you ever be tempted to buy an electric car? What are the things that hold you back from buying a battery vehicle? Please boot the like button if you found this video interesting, and let me know what you'd like to see in future videos. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do so. It helps us out as a channel, makes us look bigger, and the algorithm starts to love us, and you won't miss out on the great content we've got coming up. I'd love you to stay tuned, and I've lined these videos up for you in this playlist that you should find really interesting. See you in these next videos.